Rome, almost 2,000 years after Nero's reign. Only little remains of his rule. A handful of inscriptions, some busts and columns, and tons of time-honored rubble. As a result, modern historians rely largely on the chronicles of classical writers, such as Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio to judge Nero. But were they reliable witnesses to Nero's life? And can their testimony be trusted?
Nero was the victim of two historians who had a hostile attitude towards him, especially his contemporary, or near-contemporary, Tacitus.
Was Nero a cold-blooded monster, or the victim of a smear campaign by his chroniclers? Massimo Fini, a Nero biographer, believes that the real Nero had little in common with the image he has today. A look at his life story casts some light on a man whose 14-year reign was one of the most peaceful periods in Roman history. The adolescence of an emperor. Rome, 54 AD. The imperial litter is carried to the camp of the Praetorian Guards, the emperor's bodyguards. Nero should traditionally be riding there on horseback, but incessant rain has prevented him from doing so. It's his first important appearance. At the age of 17, he already bears the title of emperor, but it's only with the support of his soldiers that he can wield real power. Nero, the ruler of one of the mightiest empires in ancient history, was still very young. But for a Roman emperor, the decisive factor was not experience or talent alone, but influence and family background. Nero's mother, Agrippina, born into the family of Julius Caesar and the Emperor Claudius, was predestined to a share in the might of Rome. Nero grew up with his aunt. He and Agrippina never had a normal relationship. Chroniclers portray this beautiful woman as ambitious, cold-hearted, and obsessed with power. It's said that Agrippina even seduced her own son, allegedly in the imperial litter. To Agrippina, Nero was probably little more than a ticket to power, a man to be kept as dependent as possible for her own purposes. And she was prepared to use any means necessary to achieve these ends. With Nero on the imperial throne, Agrippina wanted a share of his power. Nero's predecessor, the aging Emperor Claudius, had already fallen prey to Agrippina's seductive powers. He made her his wife and thus empress. She then persuaded Claudius to marry her son Nero to his daughter Octavia. But that was not enough for her. She even managed to talk him into adopting Nero, even though he had a son of his own, Britannicus. Then, having achieved her goal, Agrippina wasted no time in having Claudius poisoned, clearing the way for her son. Nero was made emperor, but Agrippina held the reins of power, and she openly flaunted her political dominance by having coins minted bearing her image.
Although it was not recorded at the time, this coin must have caused quite a fuss in Rome.
Never before had a woman been depicted like this. The front of a Roman coin had always been reserved for the ruler of the empire, but now Agrippina's title was on the front and Nero's merely on the back. What's more, Agrippina's name and title were in the nominative case normally used for the emperor, whereas Nero's details were in the dative. The message was clear.
Agrippina ist die Handelnde und sie gibt etwas.
Agrippina was the active one, who gives Nero something. Nero receives. Agrippina could not have found a clearer way of expressing her intentions.
A cameo in the Shrine of the Three Kings in Cologne Cathedral depicts Nero being crowned by his mother. It too was probably commissioned by Agrippina. Cameos were commonly presented as official gifts in ancient Rome, and this one would have carried the same message as the coins, that Agrippina held sway over Rome and its emperor. But Nero gradually began to elude his mother's control. The reason for this seems to have been a young woman, a freed slave called Claudia Acta. Nero fell in love and showered presents on the girl from Syria. He even promised to marry her.
Agrippina war sicher keine Moral.
Agrippina was certainly no moralist. She probably would not have minded Nero having an affair. But it posed a threat to her if it meant Nero was being influenced in a manner she couldn't control.
Einfluss, den sie selber nicht kontrollieren konnte, dann wurde das gefährlich.
When in 55 AD Agrippina heard about the affair, she's said to have been furious. Fearing the loss of her influence and thus her power, she tried to win Nero back by her usual methods. Of course, no one knows exactly what happened that evening. Nero is believed to have succumbed to his mother's advances, but in all probability, the incident deepened the rift between mother and son. An open power struggle broke out. Agrippina publicly questioned Nero's position and tried to put him under pressure. Viewed in the context of the Julian and Claudian families, this mother-son relationship was not all that unusual. Human genes don't just determine physical traits like eye and hair color, build and voice. In combination with family circumstances and upbringing, they can also determine behavior. Nero's ancestors were unpredictable characters, prone to violence like the Ahenobarbus family, warriors like Mark Antony and Germanicus, touched by genius or madness like Caesar and Caligula.
Trebuie să ne gândim în primul rând din ce familie.
If we take a closer look at this family, we find that Nero's mother and father were known for their excessive lifestyles. In fact, that was true of the whole dynasty. In any case, his mother, Agrippina, had an incestuous relationship with her brother, Caligula.
Era sora cu Caligula. Caligula, la rândul său, acuzat chiar de incest.
Nero began increasingly to distance himself from his mother. The Roman historian Tacitus says Agrippina threatened to groom Claudius's son Britannicus, in other words, Nero's stepbrother, as a rival for the throne. To prevent this, Tacitus wrote, Nero felt obliged to commit a most heinous act. In 55 AD, an official banquet was held in Rome in honor of Britannicus. Tacitus claims that Nero obtained a powerful poison from a woman renowned for her potions. And in order to bypass the food taster, Nero arranged for Britannicus to be served a very hot but non-poisonous drink. Tacitus says the poison was put in a jug of cold water that was then added to cool the drink, water that had not been tasted in advance. But was this possible?
Este cert că, mai ales în cazul...
There's no doubt that a family like Nero's, which, after all, had a history of poisonings, would have adhered very strictly to the rule that every drink and every morsel of food was tasted in advance.
Că regula pregustării oricărei mâncări sau oricărei băuturi trebuia să fi fost respectată.
It hardly seems likely, therefore, that Britannicus could have been served a drink that had not been tasted, even water. And Tacitus must have known how strict court etiquette was. In this respect, at least, the chronicler's version of events must be viewed with some skepticism. Assuming Nero really did want to take Britannicus's life, wouldn't he have found a more discreet method somewhere in the sprawling palace? Another factor raises doubts about the reliability of Tacitus's story. His description of the young Britannicus's dying moments emphasizes the poison's potency. He reports that the poison acted quickly, very quickly, too quickly.
Ein Gift, das so schnell wirkt.
In those days, snake venom was the only poison which could have worked as quickly as the report suggests. And we can be certain that snakes were not used, as in the case of Cleopatra.
Historical sources provide clues to the kinds of poisons the Romans used. These include poisons based on hemlock or poppy seed. Political poisonings were commonplace. It was a particularly insidious way of ridding oneself of annoying rivals. Indeed, poison played such an important role in those days that many more prominent personalities may have fallen victim to it than has actually been recorded. All these poisons were highly effective and often tasteless. The symptoms they produced were similar to those of common illnesses. But today we can say with certainty that they would all have worked very slowly. So, if Nero's stepbrother wasn't poisoned, how then did he die?
It's very likely that he died of a fit, since he'd suffered from epilepsy all his life. It certainly wasn't Nero, who had no power at that time and no ambitions to gain power. And as I said, he'd even threatened to abdicate.
Senator and later Emperor Otho was a trusted friend of Nero's. He and his wife Poppaea Sabina were to turn the power struggle between Nero and his mother into a life-or-death battle. Nero probably met Poppaea at a banquet, that combination of culinary delights and performing arts of which he was so fond. Like Nero, Poppaea loved dance and art, and she shared his taste for all things Greek. Chroniclers describe her as beautiful, charming, highly educated, and somewhat flirtatious. Otho may well have brought them together for his own personal gains. On account of the opulent and hedonistic life he had led since childhood, he was more corrupt than any other man in Rome, the Greek philosopher Plutarch wrote of Otho. Poppaea's ambition was greater than that of her predecessor, Claudia Acta. She wasn't content to be merely the emperor's mistress, she wanted to become empress. But she wasn't even from a senatorial family, and Nero was still married to Claudius's daughter Octavia. Nero's mother, Agrippina, must indeed have been deeply offended by her son's behavior, which contravened the code of honor of the House of Augustus, the Domus Augusta.
Solange mit seiner Frau verheiratet war
naturally, Nero's hands were tied while he was still married, and he must have known that his mother would not accept an attempt to legitimize the relationship by remarrying.
durch diese Heirat nicht einfach hin akzeptieren würde.
Agrippina still had plenty of allies and supporters. A public dispute with her would have been dangerous, even for Nero. So, in March 59 AD, he decided to get rid of his mother. An opportunity presented itself in the form of the Minerva festival, to which Agrippina was to travel aboard a brand new ship. Under absolute secrecy, Nero had a magnificent galley constructed with an ingenious mechanism that allowed it to be broken in two on command. The aim? To make murder look like an accident. But the ship carrying Agrippina sank too slowly, and she was able to swim back to the nearby shore.
It was Seneca who pushed him into making a decision. He told Nero, either you kill your mother or your mother will kill you. Faced with this choice, Nero decided to kill Agrippina.
By now, Agrippina must have known who was behind the attempt on her life. The philosopher Seneca, the emperor's advisor and erstwhile tutor, was a bitter political opponent of Agrippina's. He played on Nero's fears of a possible coup and his mother's revenge until the young emperor came up with another plan. And when, as form required, Agrippina sent Nero news of her miraculous escape, Nero put his new plan into action. he dropped a concealed knife at the messenger's feet, crying, "An assassin! An assassin! Put him in chains. My mother has sent him to kill me." The alleged attacker was led away. Nero must have been extremely frightened to have tried so openly to kill his mother. Agrippina's alleged plot justified immediate action. Her alleged crimes were read out to the Senate and her memory cursed. But the people of Rome remained suspicious.
Aber es ist doch vielleicht bezeichnend, dass sofort Aufschriften.
It's interesting to note that immediately afterwards, inscriptions appeared on public buildings that read, "Nero Orestes Alcmaion." Everyone murders their mother. In other words, the public quickly found out, or drew their own conclusions about what had happened.
Oder geschlossen, was eigentlich geschehen ist.
But Octavia still stood between Poppaea and the empress's throne.
Octavia was his wife from a marriage arranged by Agrippina when he was 12 and Octavia 8. He never loved her, and they were never close. She did not share his taste, and he did not find her attractive.
Nero claimed infertility as grounds for a divorce from Octavia, an outrageous move, since it's believed he never slept with her. Octavia was sent away to Campania, but Nero and Poppaea had underestimated Octavia's popularity with the masses. The people of Rome took to the streets demanding her return, and Nero gave in. This was misinterpreted by the public as a reconciliation of the imperial couple. Poppaea saw her marriage plans under threat. Octavia, the daughter of the former Emperor Claudius, was too popular and from too noble a family to simply make her disappear. So Nero's chief of police, Tigellinus, possibly under pressure from Poppaea, hatched a plot against Octavia. Tigellinus had her servants arrested and tortured in order to press incriminating statements from them. But even in the depths of Rome's dungeons, Octavia's servants remained true to their mistress. One maid, Pitia, spat in Tigellinus's face during her interrogation, shouting, "My mistress's private parts are cleaner than your mouth." Even so, Tigellinus was able to collect enough evidence for his needs. Octavia was banished to the small Mediterranean island of Pandateria. She was accused of seducing Anicetus, who had already murdered Agrippina, and of having an abortion, despite her alleged infertility. Her murderers were already on their way. Tacitus's version of Octavia's murder is melodramatic. The historian becomes a storyteller when he claims to quote Octavia's last words. "Please don't hurt me. Spare me. I'm only the emperor's sister." Who would have told him this? Her assassins, maybe? Contemporary historians doubt that Nero alone was responsible for Octavia's murder.
I think they were both guilty, but it was Poppaea who actually gave the order for Octavia to be killed. She was determined to marry Nero, and she was pregnant, so she wanted to clear the way for marriage and for becoming empress.
A happy period was now to follow in Nero's life, at least according to his biographer Massimo Fini.
Nero was a highly intelligent person, and so was Poppaea. They both loved Greek culture, they both loved life, and they enjoyed a harmonious sex life, so everything worked fine.
But in the 9th year of his reign, Nero's daughter died at the age of just 4 months. According to Tacitus, like his lust for life, his grief too knew no bounds. Tacitus describes Nero as shattered, tormented by nightmares and guilt. How then can these qualms be reconciled with his image as a cold-blooded poisoner? The funeral ceremony for her young daughter was to be one of Poppaea's last major public appearances. Though she became pregnant again in 65 AD, she did not live to give birth. Nero is said to have come home drunk one night and kicked her in the stomach, killing both Poppaea and her unborn child. But is this a fair accusation to level against a man who apparently loved his wife above all else?
Nero was desperate for another child. There's no way he could have committed a crime like that. Poppaea died, as is being proven, in a banal accident during pregnancy.
So where does the truth end and the slander begin? Only one army would ever prove a serious challenge for the military might of Rome, that of the Kingdom of Parthia in what is now Iraq. The two sides had been fighting over Armenia for 9 years. Just as Poland would one day find itself caught between Russia and Germany, so Armenia was tossed about between the two great powers surrounding it. But neither the Romans nor the Parthians wanted to simply annex Armenia, for this would have meant a protracted and costly war, probably for both sides. And so the King of Parthia and the Emperor of Rome contented themselves with trying to place their respective vassals on the Armenian throne. At first, the Parthians gained the upper hand. Their king, Vologeses, put his brother Tiridates on Armenia's throne, but this was unacceptable to Rome. In 62 AD, Nero sent General Corbulo into battle. His 62,000 legionaries secured victory, and Vologeses gave way. But Nero chose not to act like other conquerors in antiquity. He accepted the Parthian king's brother on the Armenian throne, on one condition, that he, Nero, would be allowed to crown him in a complex ceremony. Nero spent 200 million sesterces on the spectacle, an astronomical sum perhaps, but a good investment for peace. It was a solution both sides profited from. Nero could demonstrate his sovereignty over Armenia, and Vologeses had his brother on the throne. All sources of friction between the two powers were eliminated. This accord in particular shows Nero's desire for peace and his rejection of violence. During the ceremony, Nero did something that baffled the assembled guests, and not just those who had traveled from afar. The crowd of several thousand witnessed a performance unlike any other by a previous Roman potentate. But why did he risk public ridicule? On the one hand, Nero probably availed of every opportunity to make a public appearance. On the other, he may not have wanted to humiliate Tiridates entirely and viewed his show as a gesture of reconciliation. But there's more to it than that.
Of course, it caused a huge scandal, and it was a significant factor in his downfall. It was a very modern attempt by Nero to replace war with art, to replace bloody conflict with reason and art.
The Romans loved victorious warriors and blood in the arena. Panem et circenses, bread and circuses were key aspects in the lives of the Roman people. Indeed, the emperor was duty-bound to provide entertainment for the people. But Nero was repulsed by brute force and the sight of gladiators fighting to the death. So he abruptly banned such events, destroying an entire industry and a time-honored tradition with a single edict. Naturally, it brought him more enemies than friends. Influenced as he was by Greek culture, Nero sought to replace violent man-to-man combat with plays, dance performances, or animal hunting. The man who for the last 2,000 years has been seen as the archetypal bloodthirsty, sadistic autocrat had actually had to contend with accusations of being too moderate and accommodating. The people mocked him for being so meek. His break with ancient tradition earned him the disapproval of the nobility, the Senate, wealthy landowners. In short, the entire upper echelon. Few wanted to do without the gladiators' fights. The public grew restive, but Nero was not to be swayed.
Why did he try to substitute the gladiators' fights, which were, after all, extremely bloody battles, with music, theatre, dance, with art? All his actions indicate that for him, art was something very important, every bit as noble as war, the great Roman myth of the time. It was his attempt to start a cultural revolution.
On August the 10th, 66 AD, Nero fulfilled his greatest dream. Ignoring his advisors' warnings of a plot at home, he set off for Greece. He had decided to leave Rome for a year and devote himself to his art. Accompanied by thousands of men with string instruments, bows and theatrical masks, he marched in procession along the Via Appia. Their first stop was the port of Brindisi, where he set sail for Greece. To Nero, Greece was the cradle of art, the source of all culture. He longed to match himself against the most famous Hellenic singers, turning the journey of a Roman emperor into an artistic tour. It didn't take a soothsayer to predict how the referees would judge this athlete and competitor, who just happened to be the most powerful man in the world. The winner was obvious even before the start. In order to prevent Nero's victorious tour from degenerating into a farce, aging singers were hired, whose voices were still good, but who no longer had any ambition to win prizes. No one knows if the conceited artist Nero saw through this ploy. In the spring and summer of 67 AD, Nero took part in the Nemean, Pythian, Isthmian and Olympic Games. These classical Greek games were even rescheduled, so Nero's journey would not be delayed. The musical emperor won a total of 1,808 laurel wreaths on his tour. But this didn't stop him cashing in the accompanying prize money to replenish his empty state coffers. So what did the Greeks think of his voice? 100 years later, the Syrian author Lukian sought to answer this question. Lukian came to the conclusion that Nero was neither admirable nor ridiculous, but that his voice lacked the necessary strength on high and low notes. In other words, Nero's voice was mediocre. In mid-November, Nero wrote to all Greek cities inviting as many Greek citizens as possible to assemble in Corinth on the 28th of the month. Watched by the dignitaries of ancient Greece, he announced his decision to make Greece a free country. It was a decision of immense political significance, for Greece was a Roman province at this time, and thus part of the Roman Empire. The essence of his message to the Greek notabilities was, other emperors have freed cities. Nero, however, will free an entire province. According to this declaration of independence, Greece would no longer have a Roman governor and would therefore be exempt from paying tributes to Rome. But it was not entirely free. since Rome still controlled foreign policy. Even so, the move enraged the Senate, for it meant a hefty loss of tax revenue for the Roman state. The subsequent emperor, Vespasian, lost no time in revoking this decision. The Greeks, however, held fond memories of Nero. Nero wanted to create a Neropolis, but the ancient city of Rome stood in his way. It was the dream of a megalomaniac, and one that would become his people's worst nightmare. Nero ordered the Praetorian Guard to set Rome on fire. At least, that's how one rumor goes. Even Nero's enemy, Tacitus, was skeptical about the talk of Nero the arsonist. But as the centuries passed, this rumor, which even Nero's contemporaries dismissed, became the accepted version of events. What were the circumstances that gave rise to this rumor, and why has it been given more credence over the ages? Chroniclers tell of secretive figures, Praetorian guards, they claim, fanning the flames and setting buildings alight. But this is indeed extraordinary, since the Praetorian guards were also Rome's firemen. On the night of July the 18th, 64 AD, disaster struck the city, leaving many thousands dead. Rome burned for 7 days. Only 4 of the city's 14 administrative districts escaped the voracious flames.
Das Feuer in der gesamten Stadt, diese Feuerwalze, die sich gebildet hat.
Yes, the fireball that swept through the city must have had a burning power of several hundred megawatts, maybe as much as a gigawatt. This incredible amount of energy would have generated an enormous backdraft, a real storm. According to our calculations, the radiated heat must have been so great that nobody could get within 30 meters of the fire. Anyone who tried to get any nearer would have suffered severe burns. There would also have been a gigantic thermal, which could have sucked up burning beams into the air, only to send them crashing down again like firebombs on buildings hundreds of meters away. In other words, nobody would have been able to control a fire of that scale, even with the equipment at our disposal today.
At the time, Nero was staying at his country estate in Antium, about 50 kilometers south of Rome. When he learned of the scale of the disaster, he immediately hurried back to Rome. But it was too late. His new palace, extending from the Palatine Hill to the Esquiline Hill, was also ablaze. Nero could only watch helplessly as his beloved art collection was devoured by the flames. The priceless and irreplaceable collection was lost forever. A century after the fire, the writer Cassius Dio would claim that Nero, dressed as a bard, had sung from the highest point of Palatine Hill while Rome burnt. But this is hardly plausible, as the flames would have made it impossible even to climb the Palatine Hill. The allegation is completely unfounded.
No ancient historian blames Nero for the fire. The accusation was made later by a Christian historian in the 4th century.
Rom ist ein Flammenmeer. Es brennt von einem Rand zum anderen. Habt ihr's gehört? Das ist mein Epos. Das Antlitz der Welt zu wandeln, alles vernichten und schaffen, leuchten.
The motion picture Quo Vadis gave perhaps the most enduring impression of Nero as arsonist.
Ich bin eins mit den Göttern, bin unsterblich. Ich bin Nero, der Künstler, der mit Feuer die Träume seines Lebens zur Wirklichkeit weckt. Brenn weiter, du altes Rom! Brenn weiter!
The fire in Rome was an accident. It happened in summer, in a city where fires were a common occurrence. Fires were bound to happen in Rome because it was built mainly of wood.
A queste cose perché era costruita tutta in legno.
But what exactly could have started the catastrophe? What really happened on that clear moonlit night in the year 64 AD? It was a typical summer in Rome. The nights were warm and the city was a hive of activity. Merchants had gathered at market stalls at the southeastern end of the Circus Maximus, displaying their merchandise. The wine flowed freely, and few precautions were taken with open fires. The heat, alcohol, fire, flammable materials, and a strong wind were a deadly combination. Perhaps the inferno was caused by carelessness or a drunken reveler. When the fire broke out, it spread rapidly through the dry wood of the buildings and market stalls, aided by strong winds, the narrowness of the lanes, and the irregular layout of the city. It's unlikely Nero was to blame for the fire. And there's another reason to suggest Nero was not the imperial arsonist of our history books.
Această implicare psihologică a lui Nero,
Nero's personality, sensitivity, and spontaneous desire to help those who had lost their homes all indicate that he was not someone who could deliberately make thousands of people homeless.
ajungă până într-acolo încât să lase fără acoperiș mii, zeci de mii de oameni.
Nero apparently had an enormous fear of fire. Yet the world's most powerful man was at the forefront of efforts to extinguish the flames. He still hoped his Praetorian Guard could gain the upper hand, but his hopes were in vain. But if Nero was innocent, who were the mysterious arsonists?
Man kann sich vorstellen, dass durch leitende Feuerwehrleute beordert Trupps unterwegs waren, die versucht haben...
It's possible that senior firefighters ordered troops to burn or tear down buildings at wide streets and squares, so there would be nothing left to fuel the main fire when it arrived there half an hour or so later.
Thousands of people were killed in the blaze. Many thousands more lost their homes. In their anger and desperation, the people cried out for a scapegoat.
E quindi gioì la comunità cristiana. Ci sono delle iscrizioni a Pozzuoli che dimostrano appunto...
The Christian community was glad that Rome had burned down. There are reports that Christians were pleased about it, so it was only logical for the government at the time to view them with suspicion. Some of them were interrogated, and there were those who, delirious at the thought of martyrdom, admitted setting Rome on fire. And these first interrogations were conducted without the use of torture.
Confessarono, prima non furono torturati questi primi, confessarono di essere gli autori dell'incendio.
Non audite quod vobit dicet.
Fraters mei, hodie iamat celum.
As a result, public anger was directed primarily at the Christians. There are no records of exactly how many men and women from Rome's Christian community voluntarily confessed to arson. What is certain is that these self-accusers were exactly what Nero's government so badly needed, scapegoats. Many of those supposedly proven guilty were sewn up in furs and fed to wild animals in the city's arenas. Most of them faced their deaths with serenity, viewing martyrdom as the passport to paradise and deliverance from a depraved world epitomized by Rome.
It's quite possible that certain of Nero's advisors persuaded him that the Christians were responsible for the fire. If this was the case, it would have been totally justifiable, from Nero's point of view, to condemn the Christians.
Many of those convicted were given the usual sentence for arson. Others were to suffer the flames they had allegedly inflicted upon others. Nero had them used as human torches for a party at the palace. This placated the people, but Christian historians would condemn him as a persecutor of Christians. In actual fact, only about 300 of Rome's 3,000-strong Christian community were put on trial.
There are no grounds for accusing Nero of persecuting Christians. It was more of a spontaneous decision, made mainly to pacify the people of Rome.
The Rome of the Republic, of Caesar and Augustus, was no more. Only rubble and ashes remained. Large areas of the city must have looked like Dresden after it was firebombed by the Allies in World War II. But Nero ensured that the reconstruction of Rome was organized perfectly. The narrow, twisting lanes were replaced by wide streets and straight blocks of houses. Ships brought corn up the river Tiber into the city, taking rubble with them on their return journey to reclaim the marshland of Ostia. And Nero commissioned a palace, or rather a whole city quarter full of luxury in the heart of Rome. For centuries, the Domus Aurea, or Golden House, was thought to have been completely destroyed. Then, during the Renaissance period, the rubble-filled chambers of the main house were discovered under the Trajan's baths. They were called grottos, but this was the embodiment of Nero's dream, the endless passages of the Domus Aurea. The highly artistic frescoes on the walls so impressed Renaissance artists that they based a style of their own on them. They called it grotesquerie. Once the whole house was sumptuously decorated with gold, precious stones and mother-of-pearl. There were banquet halls with ivory panels on the ceiling which showered the room with petals. Today, little of the ancient splendor remains. Its passages are open only to a select few for fear they might collapse. Maybe Nero's Golden House was a well-disguised expression of his fear. He was terrified of assassination attempts and avoided public places whenever possible. The Domus Aurea was his own little world. Here he felt safe from would-be assassins and traitors, and he had every reason to feel threatened. Two people were instrumental in his downfall: Galba, a general, and the philosopher Seneca, Nero's advisor and former tutor. Perhaps Nero sensed that he was surrounded by conspirators. He was hated by the nobility, senators, and the Roman army for breaking with tradition and challenging established rights. The tribune, Subrius Flavus, had almost stabbed Nero while Rome was in flames, but his co-conspirators obviously thought it was neither the right time nor the right place. The man who led the plot was Calpurnius Piso, but there was also a conspiracy among the conspirators. Piso was also to be killed to place a philosopher on the imperial throne, Seneca. The philosopher was widely respected, but he was by no means as innocent as he would have us believe.
According to Cassius Dio, Seneca was caught doing the things which he had condemned as a philosopher. He was the master of the double standard. He preached austerity, frugality, and a scorn for money, but lent out money at exorbitant interest rates and tried to get his hands on legacies.
The conspirators planned to murder Nero on April the 19th, 65 AD, at the Temple of the Sun God near the Circus Maximus. But the plot failed when a slave betrayed the conspirators. Nero forced Seneca to commit suicide. Because of his controversial business activities, Seneca was not universally popular, but he was a member of the Roman elite. In his Annals, Tacitus describes Seneca's last hours as an exact replica of those of Socrates. Thus, Tacitus gave Seneca a worthy death for a philosopher. In reality, though, Seneca suffered a slow and agonizing death, in which he slashed his wrists and took poison. But Nero's fury at Seneca's treachery was not without bounds, and he did not vent his anger on innocents. Seneca's wife, Paulina, for example, was treated with clemency. When she, too, had her wrists slashed, Nero ordered her wounds to be bandaged, allowing her to decide between life and death. When Paulina heard the order, she changed her mind about fame and martyrdom and chose life instead. She was to live for several more years. In the middle of March 67 AD, news reached Rome that the young governor of Gaul, Julius Vindex, had risen up against Nero. 2 weeks later, Galba, the governor of Hispania, joined the revolt. In an open challenge to Nero, he proclaimed himself the representative of the Senate and people of Rome. Nero broke down when he heard the news. Had he taken decisive action, he may well have crushed the opposition, since a majority of the army was still behind him. But he backed down. Nero's second Praetorian prefect, Nymphidius Sabinus, then added to the emperor's paranoia by feeding him false information. He persuaded Nero that almost all of his provincial governors had deserted him. It was a lie, of course, but Nero believed him.
The interesting thing about Nero is that he was to some extent affected less by these external political revolts themselves than by his personal encounters.
Nero fled to the country house of one of his servants. The renegade Sabinus offered 30,000 gold sesterces to every Praetorian guard and 6,000 to every legionary who would support Galba's bid to become the emperor. This then was the price placed on Nero's betrayal, but it was a price that Galba would never pay. Nero knew nothing of this and still hoped to escape with his life. He wanted to abdicate and realize his dream of a quiet life as an artist. But this was a notion foreign to Rome. Its emperors either ruled or died. On the morning of June the 9th, 68 AD, Nero's henchmen set off. But Nero avoided the dishonor of a public execution by committing suicide. Allegedly, Nero's parting words were, "I have been cursed and shamed. This is not worthy of Nero. It is not worthy." In a situation like this, one must be calm, so pluck up your courage. When a legionary tried to cut off the dead Nero's head, he was stopped by a soldier called Isilus. He wanted the emperor's corpse to remain intact. Isilus had the body wrapped in a light cloak, a final mark of respect for a leader who had commanded respect and contempt in equal amounts during his 14-year reign. Many people remained true to Nero right to the end, and he was given a fitting funeral for a Roman emperor. His ashes were brought to the Domitian's family tomb at Pincio, where the church of Santa Maria del Popolo now stands. Shortly after his death, all traces of him were wiped out. Nero's monuments were torn down, his memory cursed, and his buildings destroyed. The Amphitheatrum Flavium, later to be called the Colosseum, was built on the site of an artificial lake Nero had built. The ancient chroniclers Tacitus, Cassius Dio, and even Suetonius painted a false picture of Nero. The monster on the imperial throne never existed in that form. Nero was the product of both his age and his circumstances, hardly more cruel than his Roman predecessors or successors. He was a patron of the arts and an eminent statesman who, all too willingly, heeded the advice of hypocrites.